This is a video on mastering culture. What does it mean to be a master of culture? Well, first of all, there's the productivity of femininity. In a world that for eons has been invented by and run by men, it's not surprising that almost every improvement in every system makes the system more feminine. Uh, this has unbelievable power in corporations, which are male monkey farms. Number two, devices and technologies have their own culture. Once you can measure and specify with exactitude the culture of a particular device and or its interface, you can look at how that interacts with a equally exactly specified culture of a group of users or markets. And then you can do things like predict prices, predict sales, predict new version features, and predict which competitor loses, which wins. There's big money to be made there. Number three, the culture of business practices, total quality, strategy, global outsourcing, all of these business practices have their own culture too. And it interacts with the cultures of products and markets and customers. And if you look at these interactions, then you'll discover uh, how to make the practices work well and how to handle side effects of the practices, inevitable ones, that hurt other systems and aims of the organization. Number four, cultures have dimensions, but Hofstede's 8 dimensions, which are 40 years old, heavily biased to data, and silly just factor analysis, have been repeated and repeated for generations simply because he had a large sample size, even though it was an extraordinarily biased sample size. And recent research has soundly demonstrated that strong correlations mean nothing because they can all be wiped out by slight changes in sampling regime. So the bias in a sample is likely to be a much stronger negative effect than the strong repetitions of his factors. He doesn't admit this because he's not a statistician, but people who know statistics know what I'm talking about here. So forget his 8 dimensions, and let's move to something less general and more specific. Dimensions that are small enough and precise enough in scope to tell you what to do. And so I've moved to 64 dimensions of culture as a middle step for beginners beyond Hofstede's 8 on the way to 192 dimensions of culture, which is what I use to measure the culture of the iPhone 4S, for example, and the Galaxy 3. The culture of high performance. The culture of high performance comes from a fundamental truth that selves, cultures, and high performances are all exactly the same thing. They are all shared, heavily practiced routines. And therefore, every culture is a high performance. You can see this, of course, because it's shared routines that are effortlessly and expertly and quickly done by everyone who shares that culture. So it is a high performance. It's like the Chicago Bulls under Michael Jordan sharing moves in a basketball game that they've practiced and nobody else has practiced. So you can see that a culture is clearly a high performance, but you have to be a little smarter to see that it's also a self. The culture is a self, and therefore you can't bribe it like the American diplomats always try to do. Israel and Palestine, if you get along with each other, will give you a bridge. They are selves, and therefore they have honor, respect. They want apology. They want respect. And therefore you need to treat them like selves if you plan to be a diplomat and get things done in this world. Instead of bribe them as if giving everybody a refrigerator will make all their fact that they killed my grandmother go away. To reach high performance, then you simply have to practice shared routines more than anybody else. Now, how do you invent new cultures or make cultures stronger or create more of a culture? Well, there's 3 or 4 things you got to do. Number one, you've got to get people beyond their comfort zone. At their flow point, Csikszentmihalyi said, where they're challenged to operate beyond all their past norms and feel like they're becoming liquid, things are growing. Number two, you've got to get people to do extreme efforts where their existing ways won't suffice, where they're open to improving past ways or recombining past ways or inventing on the spot, improving better ways. And number three, you've got to get people where they can't succeed on their own, where they have to rely on the other guy, whether they like him or know him or not, in order to succeed. You've got to create regions of forced interdependency to create new cultures. The easiest way to do this, the lazy man, the idiot's way, the CEO way, is a crises. just fail long enough in some dimension until a crisis forces all those behaviors. The smart man's way to do it is mass workshop events and social design automata inside mass workshop events, where the event intensifies to the point that you get what I call a social plasma of people, where their ideas and personalities are stripped of ego and rank and interact more directly, causing social fusion, which releases a massive insight energies. The next point is amazing culture cases, and I've got 4 or 5 of them here. One of them was Sigmund Freud, and 2 things about Sigmund Freud. Number 1 is his sexual hydraulics and anal erotic model of human personality development started the week after his cocaine addiction started and ended the very week that he stopped taking cocaine. He never wrote about it again after he stopped taking cocaine, and he never wrote about it before until he took cocaine. So it's really the cocaine theory of the centrality of sex and personality. We can dismiss it entirely because if you don't take cocaine, it isn't central to your personality development. Number 2 is Freud did sent a whole bunch of German therapists to America, where psychoanalysis was more popular than in Germany. And so you had 2, 3 generations of Americans learning how to be a person by talking to a German. And this is really cross-cultural self-development assistance rather than a therapy. And we now see it was the German penchant for mythology and literature and philosophy dealing with Americans who were lost in pragmatics that weren't working. So the psychoanalysis was a cross-cultural counseling phenomenon, a cultural counseling phenomenon, not a therapy. Number 2, very, very similar, is people like my dad in World War II noticed that German boots were far better than American boots, that German tanks were far better than American tanks, and most humiliating, that German commanders were more democratically managed than American commanders, and could do exceptions to orders if the situation in the field was different than what the order assumed. And they had 2-way radios instead of 1-way radios like the Americans. The Americans had the top-down radios for you to listen to commands that told you what to do. And the Germans had 2-way radios where you could tell other people what's going on in your part of the battlefield, and everybody could collectively decide. Americans like my dad noticed this, and so very indirectly, without hurting American pride because they had won the war, 2, 3 generations of Americans studied under Peter Drucker. And what Drucker taught them was management by objectives, it was called, was German common sense management techniques of the 1920s. And so you had, after World War II, the entire American business population studying how Germans in the 1920s did management. Again, it's a cultural phenomenon and not a technique, business technique. Number 3, when Japan went around the world in the 1970s and 80s, destroyed American 11 and European industries with better quality products more cheaply made, the response of Harvard University was to tell lies. And so instead of teaching Japanese management, Japanese manufacturing, Japanese inventory, Japanese customer needs study, they taught lean this, lean that. Lean, and the word lean was a way to not say Japanese. And I thought that was intellectually dishonest and cowardly. And it was done by Harvard. It was led by professors like Wheelwright and Clark at Harvard. And so Harvard was the leader of this lie, this misattribution of what we were learning from. Now, this had real consequences. We misread almost everything that we got from Japan and assimilated it to American norms so greatly. I watched this happen at the University of Chicago and at MIT, where it was made more mathematical than the Japanese had it. All the team and democratic whole workforce components were struck out, so it became a manager method instead of an every worker method. And it became fixed instead of evolutionary, where the Japanese had generations of tools that each were more sophisticated than each other that the whole workforce learned. The Americans had fixed tools which consultants then sold for their profit, like Six Sigma. Then number 4, so lean manufacturing was the refusal of proper attribution by the American culture, resulting in assimilating Japanese techniques, what made them powerful in America, assimilating all that to American ways, which already was making America unpowerful, and therefore the methods ended up being weak and useless. Number 4, TQM in Japan. Total Quality in Japan is the most successful global movement we have of any sort in history. It changed every business in the world. It formed the philosophy of horizontal processes between supply chains and customer chains to replace the vertical monkeyness of males. It corrected weaknesses in Japanese culture. It was designed by Japanese to correct weaknesses in their own management culture, 3 particular weaknesses. And it fixes those three weaknesses of Japanese culture. So it's not a Japanese movement. It's an anti-culture in Japan that Japanese hate because it requires them to change deep parts of their nature and their tradition. Now, it got exported around the world. It defeated competition all over the world, so people paid attention to it because they needed to survive. And it worked, and it had power. And so these three cultures had tremendous power. The Americans copied this anti-Japanese management set of three changes as if America has the same management culture as Japan. Of course, America's management culture has different weaknesses. And so America got almost, a sixth the impact that the Japanese got from the same methods because it was an anti-culture to Japanese traditional management culture. It was not an anti-culture to traditional American management culture. Now, it was easy to make the analogy and to look at the correspondingly different weaknesses in American culture and change the tools to handle that. Nobody in America did that. They didn't have the brains to do that. So they missed the fact that it was an anti-Japanese culture they were copying. They thought it came from Japan, so it's Japanese. Stupid. Silicon Valley in the United States. And you've got to explain why business schools in the 1970s and 1980s had nothing to do with Silicon Valley, ignored it, didn't research it, no papers, no departments, no sections of entrepreneurship, just how to go to Wall Street and steal money from old ladies. And so suddenly in 1988 to 1990, Harvard decides to have one course on entrepreneurship. And then 2000, they decide to have 5 courses on entrepreneurship. And so 30 years too late, the business schools get interested in what Japan did. I mean, every business in the world learned how to do business from Japan in the 1970s and 1980s. There's no question about that. It's really documented. And nobody learned how to do business from any American business school for 20 years. And if you're young and you haven't seen this, it's hard to believe, but it's really, literally, unexaggeratedly true. Nobody learned anything about business from any American business school between 1970 and 1990. They learned it from Japan. Japan created a philosophy of business that allowed the internet to be spread around the world to businesses. A philosophy of horizontal processes, not monkey rank crap, which is what Harvard creates, and the East Coast MIT creates. And so you have this Silicon Valley as an anti-culture to American culture, anti-East Coast, anti-analog, anti-monkey hierarchy, anti-blue suits. And that's what made it powerful. California itself was an anti-culture, and inside of that, Stanford was an anti-culture, and inside of that, Silicon Valley was an anti-culture. And once you understand the power of Silicon Valley comes from its anti-ness of its culture, you become as powerful as they are.